There have been claims from people in the Tennessee Valley that they're getting fraudulent voter registration forms in the mail. Our Sydney Stallworth looked into this. She tells us what to look out for.
A viewer sent in this tip that they received a voter registration form from a third-party mailer and they were worried it could be fraudulent. Well, I checked in with the Secretary of State. He says his office is well aware of this particular sender, and voters who fill out this form could be in for a shock come Election Day.
If that individual actually completed the form and it did not end up going to the place where it needs to go, which is the border registrar's office in that particular county, that individual may think they're a registered voter.
This could cause confusion at the polls.
They may actually try to show up on Election Day, November the 3rd, and then wonder why, in spite of the fact that they completed the form some 6 weeks to 2 months ago, that their name was not on our voter rolls.
Here are some photos of the letter people are getting in the mail. The letter is sent by the Election Mail Service out of Austin, Texas. It encourages voters to visit alvotes.org, a site that is not associated with the Office of the Secretary of State, and alerts recipients that they're not registered to vote. The state says to disregard this form.
The thing that needs to be known about this particular mailer is it was not produced by the Office of the Secretary of State, has not been endorsed by the Office of the Secretary of State, and is not intended to be a technique used by the Secretary of State to encourage people to become registered voters.
Voters have reported getting mail from this sender in Austin addressed to deceased family members. This can be painful and confusing.
Unfortunately, these people who have created this list have purchased a list from some source that's unknown, that's in some instances several years old.
So what should you do if you get some questionable voter mail?
They simply need to contact our office as soon as possible and we'll begin an investigation.
You can check your official registration status on alabamavotes.gov, and that's Alabama, the word spelled out. And you can find more information on how to report questionable voter mail on rocketcitynow.com. Putting the Valley first, I'm Sydney Stallworth, WZDX News.